I found my son sitting on the curb outside his own house. His daughter was beside him, clutching a stuffed rabbit, and 3 garbage bags filled with clothes sat at their feet. When he looked up and saw my truck pulling into the driveway, his face crumbled. "Dad," he said, his voice breaking. "They changed the locks. They said we don't belong here anymore." I looked at my granddaughter, 5 years old, still wearing her pajamas at 2 in the afternoon, completely unaware that her world had just been torn apart. I looked at my son, 34 years old, a surgeon who had saved hundreds of lives, now sitting on a curb like a discarded piece of furniture. I smiled. "Get in the truck," I said calmly. My son had no idea that I already knew everything. He had no idea that I had been waiting 18 months for this exact moment, and he certainly had no idea that what was about to happen would bring an empire to its knees. Hey everyone, thanks for being here. If you enjoy stories about justice and family loyalty, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter. Drop a comment below and tell me what you would have done in my position. And remember, while this story is inspired by real events, some details have been changed for privacy and storytelling purposes. The lessons, however, are absolutely real. The first thing I noticed was the silence. My son Daniel had stopped crying somewhere around the 2nd mile of our drive. Now he just stared out the window, watching the Boston suburbs pass by in a blur of autumn colors and expensive real estate. His daughter Lily had fallen asleep almost immediately, her small body curled against his side, that stuffed rabbit still pressed to her chest. I kept my eyes on the road. Patience. That was the first lesson I ever learned in business. Patience and observation. Most people rush to fill silence with words, with explanations, with desperate attempts to make sense of chaos. But silence is where truth lives. Silence is where you learn what people really are. We drove for 15 minutes before Daniel finally spoke. "He fired me, Dad." His voice came out hollow, like someone had scooped out everything inside him and left only the shell. "Doctor, Hayes called me into his office this morning. Said the hospital board had conducted a review of my surgical outcomes. Said there were concerns about my performance. I adjusted my grip on the steering wheel. Said nothing." "That's impossible," Daniel continued, and now I could hear the anger creeping in beneath the devastation. "My outcomes are the best in the department. I've had 0 complications in the last 18 months. 0. I have the documentation to prove it." Still, I said nothing. And then, when I came home to tell Megan, to figure out what we were going to do, his voice cracked again. The locks were changed. Her father was there. He said the house was always in Megan's name. Said I had no legal right to be there. Said I should have read the prenup more carefully. The prenup. I remembered that document. I remembered the night Daniel had called me, excited and nervous, saying that Megan's father wanted them to sign some standard paperwork before the wedding. I remembered telling him to have a lawyer review it. I remembered him saying he trusted Megan, that her father was just being protective, that it was nothing. That was 6 years ago. 6 years of marriage. 6 years of my son building a life with a woman whose family saw him as nothing more than a useful tool. "And Lily?" I asked quietly. It was the first thing I had said since we got in the truck. Daniel's hand moved instinctively to his daughter's sleeping form. He said. Daniel stopped, swallowed hard. He said Lily would stay with her mother, said the custody agreement was already filed, said I would get supervised visitation twice a month if I didn't cause any trouble. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not anger. Something deeper than anger. Something that had been building for 18 months. Ever since I first noticed the way Dr. William Hayes looked at my son across the dinner table at Thanksgiving. The way a predator looks at prey that doesn't know it's already been marked. "Daniel," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I need you to listen to me very carefully." He looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw the question forming in his eyes. What happened today was not about your performance. It was not about the prenup. It was not about anything you did or didn't do. I turned onto the highway, heading toward my house in the suburbs where real decisions were made far from the polished halls of Boston Medical Center. This has been planned for a very long time, and I have been watching them plan it. Daniel's breathing changed. I could hear it even over the hum of the engine. "Dad," he said slowly, "how much do you know?" I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. Just for a moment. Just long enough for him to see my expression. Not sad, not angry. Waiting. Calculated. The expression of a man who had spent 40 years building a medical technology company worth $2 billion. A man who understood that some battles were won not through force, but through patience. "I know everything," I said simply, "and now it's time for you to understand what we're going to do about it." 18 months earlier, I had sat across from my son at a restaurant in downtown Boston, watching him describe his new position at Boston Medical Center with all the enthusiasm of a man who believed he had finally arrived. "Dr. Hayes specifically recruited me," Daniel had said, cutting into his steak with the precision of a surgeon. "He reviewed my work at Johns Hopkins, said I was exactly what the department needed, said he wanted me to be part of the family. Part of the family." Those words had settled in my stomach like stones. I had built Chen Medical Technologies from nothing. Started with a single patent for a surgical imaging device that I developed in my garage when Daniel was still in diapers. By the time he graduated medical school, the company was worth $800 million. By the time he married Megan Hayes, it was worth nearly $2 billion. I had learned, over those 40 years, to recognize patterns, to see the architecture beneath the surface of things, to understand that people rarely did anything without reason, especially people with power. Dr. William Hayes had power. He was the CEO of the largest hospital network in New England, a man whose influence extended into insurance companies, pharmaceutical boards, and state medical licensing committees. A man who had built his empire through strategic acquisitions and carefully cultivated relationships, and he had recruited my son, not because Daniel was an exceptional surgeon, though he was, not because he wanted to bring new talent to his department, though that was the official story. He recruited my son because my son was married to his daughter, because my son had access to me, because Chen Medical Technologies held patents that Hayes Medical Network wanted. I had suspected this from the beginning, but suspicion was not enough. I needed to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with before I could respond. So I watched. I waited. I documented. The first sign came 3 months after Daniel started at Boston Medical. Megan began asking questions about my company's patent portfolio. Casual questions at first. The kind a curious daughter-in-law might ask at family dinners. What were we working on? When would the new surgical imaging system be released? Had we considered partnering with any hospital networks? I answered vaguely. Watched her reaction. Noted the slight tightening around her eyes when I didn't give her what she wanted. The second sign came 6 months later. Daniel mentioned that Dr. Hayes had asked him to attend a strategy meeting about potential technology acquisitions. My son was a surgeon, not a business executive. There was no legitimate reason for him to be in that meeting, unless he was there to provide information about my company. I began my own investigation quietly. Hired a private security firm that specialized in corporate intelligence. Had them look into Hayes Medical Network's finances, its acquisition history, its legal strategies. What they found confirmed everything I suspected. Hayes Medical Network was in trouble. The expansion over the last decade had been funded largely through debt, and several of their recent acquisitions had underperformed. They were facing pressure from investors to show growth, to demonstrate that the network was still capable of generating returns. And there was my company, Chen Medical Technologies, $2 billion in value. Patents that would revolutionize surgical imaging for the next 20 years. A founder who was 62 years old and had a son married into the Hayes family. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. If they could get access to my patents, either through acquisition or through licensing deals that heavily favored their network, they could solve their financial problems overnight. And the easiest way to get that access was through my son. But there was something else. Something my investigators discovered that changed everything. Lily, my granddaughter, the 5-year-old girl who called me Grandpa Thomas and always asked me to read her the same story about the little rabbit who got lost in the forest. She wasn't Daniel's daughter. The DNA test results sat in my safe for 3 weeks before I could bring myself to look at them again. I had ordered the test on a hunch, a terrible suspicion that had formed when I noticed the way Megan looked at her phone whenever Daniel entered the room. The way she scheduled business trips that coincided with conferences in cities where a certain colleague of Dr. Hayes happened to be presenting. The colleague's name was Dr. Robert Mercer, 42 years old, chief of cardiology at Hayes Medical Network's flagship hospital. A man who had been photographed with Megan at 3 separate industry events over the past 4 years, always standing just a little too close. The DNA results were unambiguous. Daniel shared 0 genetic markers with Lily. Dr. Robert Mercer was a 99.97% match. I sat with that knowledge for 3 weeks. Thought about what it meant. Thought about my son, who had changed diapers and read bedtime stories and rushed home from the hospital whenever Lily had a fever. Thought about the life he had built on a foundation of lies. And I made a decision. I would not tell him. Not yet. Not until I had built a case so complete, so undeniable, that when the truth came out, there would be no question about what had happened and who was responsible. I would give my son the tools to survive this. And then I would watch the Hayes empire burn. Daniel spent the first week at my house in a state of shock. He barely ate. He slept 14 hours a day. He stood by the window for hours, watching nothing, his mind clearly somewhere else entirely. Lily, thankfully, was resilient in the way only children can be. She treated the change in living situation as an adventure. Grandpa's house had a big backyard. Grandpa's house had a dog. Grandpa let her eat ice cream after dinner. She asked about her mother occasionally. Daniel always said the same thing. Mommy is busy right now, but you'll see her soon. On the 8th day, I called Daniel into my study. Sit down, I said, gesturing to the leather chair across from my desk. He sat. He looked better than he had a week ago. Some color had returned to his face. Some life had returned to his eyes. I slid a folder across the desk. What is this? He asked. Open it. He did. I watched his face as he read the first page, the second, the third. I watched the confusion transform into disbelief, then into something harder. This is... He stopped. Swallowed. Started again. This is a record of every conversation Megan had with her father about acquiring Chen Medical Technologies. Yes, these are dated 18 months ago, before I even started at Boston Medical. Yes, Dad. He looked up at me, and I saw the question forming. The same question he had asked in the truck. How long have you known about this? I began documenting their activities 17 months ago, I said calmly. When I first noticed patterns in Megan's behavior that suggested she was gathering intelligence about my company. 17 months. Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper. You've known for 17 months that my wife was spying on me, that her father was using me to get to your company, and you didn't tell me. No. Why? I leaned forward, meeting his eyes. Because knowing is not enough. Because I needed to understand the full scope of their operation before we could respond effectively. Because if I had told you 17 months ago, you would have confronted Megan. She would have denied everything. Her father would have adjusted his strategy, and we would have lost any chance of proving what they were doing. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. I could see him processing, the surgeon's mind working through the logic, evaluating the strategy. There's more, he said finally. It wasn't a question. I slid another folder across the desk. This one was thicker. It contained financial records showing that Hayes Medical Network had transferred significant funds through shell companies over the past 3 years. It contained emails between Dr. Hayes and his legal team discussing how to structure a friendly acquisition of Chen Medical Technologies. It contained a draft of a patent licensing agreement that would have given Hayes Medical exclusive rights to my surgical imaging technology for a fraction of its value, and it contained the DNA test. Daniel stared at that page for a long time. His hands didn't shake. His expression didn't change. He just stared, reading the results over and over, as if repetition might somehow alter the numbers. Lily, he said finally, is not your biological daughter. The father? Dr. Robert Mercer, chief of cardiology. He's been having an affair with Megan for at least 5 years, based on my investigator's findings. Daniel set the folder down. He stood. He walked to the window and looked out at the yard where Lily was playing with my dog, completely unaware that her entire identity had just been rewritten. I raised her, he said quietly. From the moment she was born, I was there for every milestone, every fever, every nightmare, every first day of school. Yes. Does that matter? I stood and joined him at the window. Below us, Lily threw a tennis ball for the dog, laughing when he brought it back covered in drool. It's the only thing that matters, I said. Biology determines genetics. It doesn't determine family. You chose to be her father every single day for 5 years. That choice is more real than any DNA test. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. What do we do now? He asked. Now we prepare. The custody hearing is in 3 weeks. Hayes thinks he's already won. He thinks you're broken, isolated, without resources. He has no idea what we've been building. What have we been building? I smiled. It was not a warm smile, a reckoning. The next 3 weeks were the most intensive of my life. Every morning at 6, Daniel and I met in my study to review strategy. Every afternoon, I coordinated with the team I had assembled. Every evening, we sat with Lily and pretended that the world wasn't about to change. The team consisted of 4 people. Patricia Morrison, a family law attorney with a reputation for destroying unprepared opponents. Marcus Webb, a former FBI forensic accountant who now consulted on corporate fraud cases. Sarah Chen, my niece, who worked in hospital administration and had quietly been gathering information about Hayes Medical's internal operations for the past year. And Michael Torres, a private investigator who had been documenting Megan's activities since I first suspected something was wrong. Patricia had reviewed the prenuptial agreement and found multiple clauses that were potentially unenforceable. The custody arrangement Hayes had filed was based on the assumption that Daniel would not challenge it. We were going to challenge everything. Marcus had traced the shell company transactions and identified patterns consistent with money laundering. Not enough for criminal charges yet, but enough to raise serious questions about Hayes Medical's financial integrity. Sarah had documented a pattern of patient complaints and suspicious billing practices at 3 Hayes Medical facilities. Nothing that would make headlines, but everything that would matter to state medical licensing boards. And Michael had photographs, video, audio recordings obtained through entirely legal means. A comprehensive record of Megan's affair with Dr. Mercer, including multiple occasions when Lily had been left with babysitters while her mother met her lover at hotels. We were not going to simply defend ourselves. We were going to expose every lie, every manipulation, every calculated betrayal. And we were going to do it in a way that left no room for doubt. The custody hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning. The night before, I sat with Daniel in the study, reviewing the final preparations. "Are you ready?" I asked. He nodded. He looked different now than he had 3 weeks ago. The devastation was still there, buried beneath the surface, but it had been transformed into something harder, something more focused. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Before tomorrow, before everything changes." I waited. When I found out about Lily, about the DNA, he paused, struggling with the words. For about 10 seconds, I felt something terrible. I felt like I had wasted 5 years loving someone who wasn't really mine, like everything I'd built was a lie. That's understandable. But then I thought about her face when she wakes up from a nightmare, how she always reaches for me first, how she trusts me completely, with that pure trust that only children have. He looked at me directly. "She's my daughter, Dad. Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever comes out, she's my daughter. I chose her. I choose her. And I will spend the rest of my life making sure she knows that." I felt something shift in my chest, something that might have been pride, or relief, or the recognition that my son had become exactly the man I had hoped he would be. "That's all I needed to hear," I said quietly. "Now get some sleep. Tomorrow, we begin." The hearing took place in a courtroom in downtown Boston. It was a custody hearing in name only. In reality, it was a battle for control. Control of a child, control of a narrative, control of an empire that had been built on lies. Dr. William Hayes arrived with a team of 3 attorneys, all of them wearing the polished confidence of people who had never lost. Megan sat beside her father, dressed in conservative blue, projecting the image of a concerned mother who only wanted what was best for her child. Daniel sat at our table with Patricia. I sat in the gallery, directly behind them, positioned so that Hayes would see me every time he looked in our direction. The judge called the hearing to order. Hayes's lead attorney began with a summary of their position. Daniel had been terminated from his position at Boston Medical due to performance concerns. The marital home was solely in Megan's name, per the prenuptial agreement. Given Daniel's unstable employment situation and living arrangements, it was in the child's best interest to remain with her mother. Standard arguments. Reasonable on the surface. Completely disconnected from reality. Patricia stood when it was our turn. Your Honor, we would like to present evidence that fundamentally contradicts the respondent's characterization of this situation. She began with the employment termination, presented Daniel's surgical outcome records, which showed 0 complications in 18 months, presented statements from colleagues at Johns Hopkins, who described him as one of the most skilled surgeons they had ever worked with, presented an internal memo from Hayes Medical, obtained through legal discovery, showing that the decision to terminate Daniel had been made 3 months before the alleged performance review. Hayes's expression didn't change. He had clearly been prepared for this line of attack. Patricia continued. She presented the financial records showing the shell company transactions, presented the emails discussing the planned acquisition of Chen Medical Technologies, presented a timeline showing that Daniel's recruitment, his marriage, his employment, and his termination had all been orchestrated to maximize the Hayes family's access to my company's patents. The judge was paying close attention now. The opposing attorneys were whispering urgently to each other, and then Patricia presented the DNA evidence. The courtroom went silent. Your Honor, we have obtained definitive proof that the child in question is not the biological offspring of our client. DNA testing confirms that the biological father is Dr. Robert Mercer, with whom Mrs. Hayes has been conducting an affair for approximately 5 years. Megan's face went pale. Hayes's mask finally cracked. I saw fury in his eyes, the kind of fury that comes when a predator realizes it has become the prey. We have documented evidence of this affair, Patricia continued, including photographs, video surveillance, and financial records showing hotel reservations that coincide with Dr. Mercer's conference travel schedules. We have evidence that Mrs. Hayes left the minor child with babysitters on multiple occasions to conduct these extramarital meetings. And we have evidence that Dr. Hayes was aware of his daughter's affair and actively participated in concealing it from our client. Patricia turned to face the opposing table directly. The respondent's custody claim is not based on the welfare of the child. It is based on a calculated strategy to maintain control over a man they have systematically deceived, exploited, and betrayed. Our client has been the primary caregiver for this child since birth. He has demonstrated consistent love, dedication, and stability despite the trauma inflicted upon him by the respondent's family. We are asking this court to recognize the truth of this situation and grant full custody to the only parent who has ever put this child's needs first. The judge called a recess. During the break, Hayes approached me in the hallway. His face was composed, but I could see the calculation behind his eyes, the mind of a dealmaker, still looking for an angle, still searching for leverage. Thomas, he said, his voice low. We should talk. This doesn't have to become more complicated than it already is. I looked at him for a long moment. This man who had recruited my son like a chess piece, who had used his daughter as a tool for corporate espionage, who had participated in a conspiracy to steal my life's work and destroy my family. Dr. Hayes, I said calmly, you made a fundamental miscalculation. You assumed that because I built my company quietly, I was weak. You assumed that because I stayed in the background, I was passive. You assumed that because I loved my son, I was vulnerable. I stepped closer to him. I have spent 40 years building things, patents, products, relationships. I have also spent 40 years learning how to protect what I build. You thought you were the predator in this situation. You were wrong. I turned and walked back toward the courtroom. "This is only the beginning," I said over my shoulder. "The medical licensing board will be receiving a package tomorrow. So will the SEC. So will the Boston Globe." Hayes's face went white. The hearing resumed. The judge, having reviewed the evidence during the recess, made her ruling with unusual speed. Full custody was granted to Daniel. Megan was given supervised visitation, pending investigation into the welfare concerns raised during the hearing. The prenuptial agreement was declared unenforceable due to fraud, and the court recommended that the matter be referred to appropriate authorities for further investigation. Daniel sat motionless for several seconds after the gavel came down. Then he turned to look at me, and I saw tears streaming down his face. Not tears of sadness, tears of relief. Tears of a man who had finally been given permission to believe that justice was possible. Lily was waiting at my house with Sarah when we arrived. She ran to Daniel the moment we walked through the door, throwing her small arms around his legs. "Daddy, did you win?" Daniel lifted her up, held her close. "Does that mean we get to stay at Grandpa's house forever?" Daniel looked at me over his daughter's shoulder. "It means we get to be together," he said. "That's what matters. We get to be together." That night, after Lily was asleep, Daniel and I sat in the study. The same study where I had shown him the evidence 3 weeks ago. The same study where we had planned our counterattack. Now, it was a place of aftermath, of processing, of beginning to understand what came next. "What happens to them?" Daniel asked. "Hayes, Megan, Mercer, the medical licensing board will investigate the patient complaints and billing irregularities. The SEC will look into the shell company transactions. The press will cover the story because it has everything they love: power, money, betrayal, a sympathetic victim. Will they go to prison? I don't know. That's not up to me. What I do know is that Hayes Medical Network will never recover from this. The reputational damage alone will cost them hundreds of millions in lost contracts. Hayes's career is over. Megan will face consequences for the fraud she participated in. Whether those consequences include prison time depends on what the investigations uncover." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "And Mercer? The biological father? He's already been contacted by investigators. He's cooperating. Apparently he wasn't aware of the full scope of what Hayes was planning. He thought he was having an affair with a willing partner. He didn't know he was part of a corporate espionage operation. Does he want to be part of Lily's life?" I considered the question carefully. "He's indicated that he would like to know her, but he also understands that you are her father in every way that matters. Any relationship he has with her will be on your terms, not his." Daniel nodded slowly. "I don't hate him," he said, sounding almost surprised by the realization. "I should hate him. He slept with my wife. He's the biological father of my daughter. But I don't hate him. I hate what was done to me. I hate the lies. But he was used too, in a way. That's a generous perspective. It's the truth. Hayes used everyone. His daughter, Mercer, me, even his own grandchild. He treated us all like pieces on a board, moved around for his benefit." Daniel looked at me. "The only person who treated me like a human being in this whole situation was you. And you did it by being patient, by planning, by waiting until you could help me in a way that actually mattered." I didn't know what to say to that. So I said, "Nothing." "Dad," Daniel continued, "I need you to understand something. What you did, the way you protected me, the way you prepared for this. I will never be able to repay that, but I also need you to know that I'm going to try. Not through money or success or any of the things that don't matter. Through being the kind of father to Lily that you were to me." I felt something shift in my chest. Something that had been wound tight for 18 months, maybe longer, finally beginning to release. "That's all I ever wanted," I said quietly. "For you to understand what family actually means. Not blood, not genetics. Choice, commitment, the decision to show up every single day and love someone more than you love yourself." We sat in silence for a while after that. Outside, the autumn wind moved through the trees. Somewhere in the house, Lily slept peacefully, unaware that her whole world had just been rewritten. In the weeks that followed, the story unfolded exactly as I had predicted. The Medical Licensing Board launched a formal investigation into Hayes' medical network. The SEC opened an inquiry into the shell company transactions. The Boston Globe ran a 3-part series on the rise and fall of Dr. William Hayes, complete with interviews from former employees who had witnessed his management style firsthand. Hayes' medical network lost 4 major hospital contracts within a month. Stock price dropped 43%. 3 board members resigned. Dr. Hayes himself stepped down as CEO, citing health concerns, though everyone knew the real reason. Meghan pleaded no contest to charges of fraud related to the prenuptial agreement. She received probation and community service. Her relationship with Dr. Mercer ended shortly after the scandal broke. Last I heard, she had moved to another city, trying to rebuild a life far from the wreckage of her father's ambitions. Dr. Mercer cooperated fully with investigators and avoided criminal charges. He requested permission to meet Lily, and after careful consideration, Daniel agreed. The meeting was supervised, careful, uncertain, but it was a beginning. Daniel returned to surgery, accepting a position at Massachusetts General Hospital, where his skills were recognized and his past was treated as exactly what it was: someone else's betrayal, not his failure. And Lily grew. She turned 6. She lost her first tooth. She learned to ride a bicycle in my backyard, with Daniel running beside her, ready to catch her if she fell. 6 months after the custody hearing, I sat in my study writing a journal entry. I had started the journal when I first discovered the conspiracy, documenting my thoughts and strategies. Now it served a different purpose. Now it was a record of what I had learned. I spent 40 years building an empire, I wrote. I thought power meant control. I thought control meant manipulating outcomes through information and leverage. I was wrong. Real power isn't the ability to bend others to your will. It's the ability to protect the people you love. It's the ability to be patient when patience is painful. It's the ability to change yourself, to admit when you've made mistakes, to rebuild relationships that matter more than any business success. My son taught me that, not through words, but through example. He discovered that the woman he loved had betrayed him. He discovered that the child he had raised was not biologically his, and his response was not anger or rejection. His response was to love harder, to commit deeper, to choose family over biology. That is the lesson I want to leave behind. Not the patents, not the company, not the money. The understanding that family is not determined by blood. It is determined by sacrifice, by showing up, by the daily decision to love someone more than you love yourself. I closed the journal and looked out the window. In the yard below, Daniel was pushing Lily on a swing I had installed the week after they moved in. Her laughter carried through the glass, pure and unshadowed, the sound of a child who knew she was loved. Dr. William Hayes sat in a courthouse 6 months later, facing federal charges for money laundering and securities fraud. The investigation I had triggered had expanded far beyond what even I had anticipated. Turned out the shell companies were connected to a larger network of financial irregularities that stretched back more than a decade. He was convicted on 7 counts, sentenced to 12 years. I did not attend the sentencing. There was no satisfaction in watching him fall. He had built his empire on lies and exploitation, and the empire had collapsed under its own weight. That was justice, not revenge. Justice. What mattered more was what happened afterward. Daniel's career flourished. He became one of the most respected surgeons in New England, known not just for his skill but for his integrity. He remarried 3 years later, a woman named Elena who loved Lily as if she were her own daughter. Lily grew into a remarkable young woman. She learned the truth about her biological father when she was 12, old enough to understand complexity, young enough to process it without being defined by it. She maintained a relationship with Dr. Mercer, but she never called him Dad. That title belonged to Daniel. It always would. And I watched it all unfold from the sidelines, finally understanding my proper role. Not the orchestrator, not the mastermind, just a father who loved his son, a grandfather who would do anything to protect his granddaughter, a man who had learned, after 60 years, that the most powerful thing you can do is simply show up. Looking back at my own story, I see a man who spent decades believing that success meant control. I was wrong. Dead wrong. If you're watching this, let me be clear. Don't make my mistakes. Don't wait until your family is under attack to realize what matters. Don't let ambition blind you to the people who need you right now. The real lesson here, the one I had to learn through pain, is this. Family isn't about blood or genetics or legal documents. It's about choice. It's about commitment. It's about the decision to love someone through the worst moments of their life, not just the best. When I finally chose my son over my pride, when I chose patience over immediate action, when I chose to build a case instead of reacting emotionally, that's when I became the father I should have been all along. Protect your children fiercely. Expose lies boldly. Choose love over power. It's the only victory that lasts.